Oh hey, it's Wes, and this video has been a long time coming. I have never spent so much time preparing for a review. And that is this, the Asustor 5404. I've waited a long time to get into NASs, or network attached storage. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. We're going to try to keep things fairly low level here to explain what this is, how it works, exactly how to make it work for you for the best, and why you need it. First of all, why you need it. If you are not redundantly backing up your files and videos and photos, you need to get on that. And a crack of thunder. And his computer went dim. This was not what he had expected, nor what he wanted. He had lost it all. There was no wedding. There were no pictures. His incompetence, his hubris, had led him to the point of destruction. I have had terrible experiences. I know some people have had not terrible experiences, but it is bound to happen after a certain amount of time. Something can go wrong and will. And the way that I have this set up is incredible for redundancy. So let's talk about that. First of all, let's take a look at the hardware here and see what sets this apart from everything else on the market. This has features that some enterprise level NASs do not have, which is just mind-blowing and fantastic. I've waited until this day to do this monumental part. Oh yeah. Let's open it up. So on the front here we have simply a magnetically attached front plate, which reveals our drive bays. But it's not all the drive bays. This is a deceptive little rig. We can pop these up, easy peasy, hot swappable, and pull out our hard disk drives. Again, we're looking at some pretty mundane stuff here, but something magical happens once we get all these out, and that leads to one of my first complaints of this. In order to access the interior of this device, you have to take out all the drive caddies first. And why would I want to access the interior when all that is so easy peasy? Well, there is some amazing stuff going on inside here. And once the drives are out, we can take out 4 screws and then push the front of the chassis back and slide it off just like that. And then when we get to the inside here, we see where the magic happens. Got a little dust here because I've had this sitting at my desk, and my desk is the dustiest place in the whole house. Once this review is done, it's going to be hidden in my network closet. In here, you can see I have 4 M.2 SSDs. And these aren't all doing the same thing. I went through a tremendous amount of trial and error to figure out the best configuration to do live, over the network, video and photo editing. That was not as simple as I expected it to be. So when you reconfigure and reformat a NAS, that's going to take you 12 to 24 hours for it to redo itself. So there was a lot of trial and error, and it took a long time. Now I have heard some criticisms that because of the architecture of the motherboard and the CPU, these are a little bit throttled. But the fact of the matter is, an M.2 card is way faster than almost any network connection is going to be able to accommodate anyway. Even if this did have a 10 gigabit Ethernet port, that still wouldn't be much of a problem. I spend at least 40 to 60 hours of my time getting this thing going to find the best configurations for you. And you know what? I'm getting hungry.
And while we get fed, this video is brought to you by Good Food, Canadian meal delivery service. I've tried a few in the past, and I found that as a vegetarian, I didn't have very many options available to me, but on Good Food, there are so many options and so many different varieties. Whether you're vegetarian or a meat eater or something in between, you can choose everything from real fancy foods to quick and easy, pre-cut portions to make your life and job easier. You can browse online or using their handy-dandy mobile app. Follow the link in the description and sign up for your free box if you're fortunate enough to be in Canada.
In our configuration here, 2 4TB drives in a RAID 1, and we have 2 1TB drives acting as an SSD cache for our HDDs. We actually have 2 volumes here. One is the principal volume, where the OS boots from, and where my hot storage is, where I can edit live. And the other one is what I call my cold storage, where although it is very fast, especially with the SSD caching, it is a little bit slower and grinds a little bit more, and I can back up my hot storage to my cold storage automatically.
Now let's quickly go through the process of creating that internal backup. So we're backing up again the SSD RAID volume to the hard disk drive cold storage volume. So every night it's going to take my huge video projects and just back up what has changed and ignore what hasn't. So if one drive does fail, that's fine. Each one is rated and redundant. But if more than one drive or an entire volume fails, I still have that all backed up. It's fantastic. Alright, let's take a couple minutes and put this thing together from scratch and see how easy it is. Now, one important note, if you want to boot and run the operating system off of your M.2 SSDs, you'll want to install 2 of them first to start your first Volume 1 RAID pair with just the SSDs installed, and then later on install the spinning disks. Because for some reason by default this wants to install the OS on the spinning disks, which is a bit of a pain, because that's not what you want if you have the option to do otherwise. When the OS is on the disks, then this thing chugs along a lot of the time. The operating system doesn't work quite as effectively because the processor and everything else on here is pretty quick. It's the disk drives that become the performance bottleneck. But when you have it on the SSDs, it's perfectly quiet 99% of the time that you're using it, and it's a little bit snappier when you're actually interacting with the operating system.
These cheap M.2 SSDs, just Crucial P3, they're some of the cheapest ones on the market. They're reliable and easily fast enough for this. You do not need to get some spec'd out Evo Samsung M.2s because this just won't be able to make use of it. Now if we come around to the back here, we will see we have a gigantic quiet fan, HDMI port, which I'm not going to use, 2 5 gig USB ports, which is great in a manner of speaking. The most useful thing that these USB ports can be used for is the expansion bay. You can attach another box that looks just like this but costs a little bit less, but has room for 4 more hard disk drives. So if you run out of space, which I'm nowhere near doing, you can continue on. Let's look at some speeds and feeds here. The way that I have this set up, you can see that I am getting 4.4 megabit per second or 4.5 up to my computer and about 1500 megabits per second back down to the device.
Now let's do a little bit of our good old-fashioned Blackmagic disk speed test for editing performance, and we're going to test it in a variety of scenarios. First of all, over Wi-Fi 6. And here you can see we're just getting 63 write and 32 megabytes per second read. Not fantastic performance for editing. Let's plug in with a hard line at 1 gigabit per second, and here we're getting 100 megabytes per second, which is sufficient for editing, not super duper snappy, but fantastic. You'll be fine, especially if you're using proxies or renders. And then if we bump up to a 2.5 gig Ethernet adapter, here we're getting 250 megabytes per second read and write. That's great performance as well. And then if we switch to a 10 gigabit Ethernet adapter, our performance kind of tapers off a bit. It looks like the most we're going to get out of this is up to 500 megabytes per second, which appears to be the most that we're going to get in our current network configuration, which we'll talk about next.
We have these two 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. Now there's a misconception about having the dual ports that you can just stick them both together and they basically work as one if you have compatible network hardware. Now, thankfully, compatible network hardware is dirt cheap now. You can get 2.5 gigabit per second switches for $50 to $80. And the prevailing wisdom was that you needed a managed switch so that you can bond or trunk those two ports together. But I'm sorry to say, Or I'm pleased to say that is not necessary, and if anything, it is detrimental. When I trunk or bond these two ports together, also called link aggregation, it actually reduced my performance. Now, if you're using a Mac to edit, which a lot of people are in the creative community, you might be tempted to enable AFP, which is a file service over the network that Apple had been using for years, but it's actually been deprecated of late. The new system that Apple wants people to move to is SMB, and especially SMB multi-channel. And that is actually the only way that you're going to get Final Cut Pro and a lot of video editing systems to work on this. So you turn off AFP because that can cause interference with the different file sharing protocols, and you don't need link aggregation. On this device, you turn on round-robin style link aggregation. You don't turn it on in the switch, which is counterintuitive, and that's going to give you your best performance. Now, I tried multiple different configurations here. As you can see, I have a lot of Ethernet adapters here. We've got 1 gig and 2.5 gig. In a video of one of the experts talking about these things, he plugged in two 2.5 gigabit adapters to his Mac and found that he could get them to bond up to 5 gigabits per second automatically. But that was actually just a glitch in the system. Sometimes macOS will let you do that, and sometimes it won't. And so it's not something that you can rely on. What about a 5 gigabit per second adapter for your computer? Well, unfortunately, number one, 5 gigabits per second is not a well-supported standard. A lot of switches don't support it. And number two, the controllers that are in those devices often aren't capable of going much past like 3 to 3.5 gigabits per second, so it's hardly even worth using over a 2.5, which costs much less, takes up less space, uses less power. If you want max performance, unfortunately you need a 10 gigabit per second adapter. This is the Thunderbolt one from OWC. As far as I can tell, one of the most reliable and performant ones. There's also one from Sabrent. Now, the problem with this one is it tends to overheat in some circumstances, but I found that as long as you just set it on its side instead of flat down, it doesn't overheat. If you have, let's say, a Mac Mini or another Mac where you can spec it to have a 10 gigabit card inside it internally, you will save money and power and time just having that in there. But if you have a MacBook Pro, unfortunately, you do have to use an adapter like that for max performance. However, just using a 2.5 gig adapter will get the job done for you for the most part. Now, I found that, unfortunately, in order to get this to work best, I have to disable my Wi-Fi and connect exclusively over the 10 gigabit connection. Otherwise, it tries to make use of both, and that network confusion and overhead just brings down the overall speed, ironically. Even though my computer is quite capable and the Asustor is having no difficulty with its own processing, again, the processor is barely being used. Now, one thing advertised as a feature of this is that you can take one of these 5 gigabit per second ports and plug an Ethernet adapter into it and expand your I/O. However, once I managed to find one that works with this, I think it has to be lower power. This Anchor one did not, but this one, just randomly off AliExpress, did work. But I can't bond the connections together in any way whatsoever. It just will not take an Ethernet adapter that's plugged into the USB and bond it to the other connections.
Now, there is a Asustor branded 2.5 gig adapter, but it's not actually sold in Canada. Costs 3 times as much, and I assume it's essentially the same thing on the inside, because it's probably going to show up exactly the same way in the system.
Even if I use it unbonded, it overall decreases the entire system performance, which is a shame. So what you want is to use two 2.5 gig connections to your switch, run your computer to the same switch. This switch here, you can put an SFP Plus device in it and get a 10 gig connection as well, which is how I do it. Now, one huge issue I had was once I got this set up in a way that should have worked ideally, the round-robin connections, going to the switch, coming back to my computer, I was still getting incredibly unreliable results. It turns out the reason for that is the network cables that came with the device itself. It came with these Cat5e cables, which is fine if this was going straight to the switch. But in my office, it was going to the Cat6a network jacks in my office, and then in that little bit of extra signal degradation, even though the jacks and the connection behind the jacks was higher quality than this, made me lose my 2.5 gig connection because I was using Cat5e cables. I'm throwing these in the garbage right now. Asustor, stop shipping with those cables. You can get dirt cheap Cat 6A cables, and once I replaced those, boom, I was off to the races. I'm really annoyed that I probably spent a week troubleshooting that problem, just because of cheap cables that came with it. You expect the cables that come with it to work ideally. It did not. In here, we also have RAM. It comes with 4 gigabytes. I upgraded mine to 16. Honestly, I don't think it's really making use of any more than 8. I would recommend maybe just getting 8, but this RAM is dirt cheap, and having more allows you to do more, and there's a lot of other stuff that you can do down the road, such as cloud hosting and sharing and just various server capabilities that RAM will help you with. But if all you're going to be doing is basic stuff, 8 gigs is going to do it. Also, inside here is a quad-core processor. It is not a powerful processor, but because it is quad-core, it can easily manage all the tasks that I have for it, and the processor rarely goes above 20% usage, which is phenomenal, which also results in this staying quiet and not having a lot of hiccups. Now, why did I break this into 2 volumes? Well, I found that when I was working, editing video off of the main volume aggregated together, number 1, it was just going crazy on those hard drives, and number 2, it wasn't as fast. Having to constantly hand off between the SSD cache and the hard disks was causing just too much overhead. And so by breaking it into 2 volumes, I get my lag-free editing, and I also get my massive storage space.
Now, one interesting thing to note about this is that if you're making an SSD cache for your hard spinning disks, there is a read cache and a write cache, and if you want it to read and write, you need 2 separate SSDs, which is a little bit annoying because it doubles what you need to get and doubles the amount of slots that you have to take up. So if you're going to do that cache, you have to get 2 matching drives. And for most work, 512 is going to be enough. If you're doing a lot of editing straight off that cache, maybe you'll want more, but I would say save the larger sizes, the 4 terabyte and such, for a dedicated editing volume.
Also, if you're doing M.2 SSD caching, you don't need more than 1 terabyte for those cards, and that's very cheap. And so unless you're doing a lot of massive file transfers above a terabyte in size, which, I mean, who is? You don't need that much. Honestly, 512 would probably be enough.
And if you're going to be putting spinning disks in here, I would recommend going with the Seagate ironwolf series, because there is an actual Seagate app that installs on this that gives you advanced health metrics and monitoring of those drives. So there's some really great synergy going on there. You definitely want to get NAS specific drives so that it'll be more reliable when bunched in together like that.
Maybe someday I'll upgrade it to 8, if it supports it, I'm not sure. All right, let's put this back together. I strongly recommend that you plug it in to a UPS. If you're not already using a UPS, you need to get a UPS. Not just to protect your system from surges, but even just from brownouts and data interruptions. And so if this is writing something and in the middle of a process and your power goes out, you do not want that to happen. One cool thing about using the NAS on a UPS is, again, you have those USB ports. You can plug your NAS into your UPS so that the NAS will safely shut down in the event of a power failure. So let's say your power is not going to come back on for a long time. That's no problem, because it will, once the power is out, safely shut itself down. You don't have to worry about anything. So now, our Asustor NAS is in another location. I am not plugged into anything on this computer here. I'm going to open up a Final Cut project. This is a massive video project that I just opened up. We have hours of 4K footage. And let's say I am just sitting in my living room, which is right there, by the way. We are pulling down some tremendous numbers, and it's a little bit slow, but it's just a little bit slow. As you can see, once my thumbnails have rendered, I'm getting smooth playback of 4K footage in the timeline. So I do have this set to better performance over better quality, but as you can see, this is perfectly usable. It's kind of as though I'm using a slightly slow computer to edit some heavy video files. So if I want to open up a project, I am capable of doing playback on that. And here's the surprise. This is stuttering a little bit. This is with no renders, no proxies. This is just the raw footage graded, playing back in multicam over Wi-Fi. It should be no surprise that if I'm using this fancy 10 gigabit Ethernet adapter, I can get smooth performance. But I can sit back in my living room and edit multi-angle 4K footage. Now, if I were to pre-render or create some proxies, this would be as smooth as could be.
All right, let's do a little editing and scrubbing over the 10 gigabit connection. And as you can see, there's really no perceptible difference between editing this way and editing off a high-speed external SSD. There's almost no lag at all. And then when we're editing over 2.5 gig Ethernet, there is a little bit of stutter, a little bit of jumpiness, but it is completely usable.
And as you can see, when connected over 10 gigabits per second, this thing just screams. It's basically the same as plugging into an external SSD, except it's hiding in my network closet and has way more total capacity.
And I hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but just having a NAS is not the end of your data security. Although I have this set up for some very interesting internal redundancy that should make this very safe, you do need multiple physical copies and an online backup if you really want to be super safe with client work. Thankfully, this NAS makes that easy. There are backup and restore systems built right in here, so you could create a backup from this NAS to another NAS at another location, or you can do an FTP backup if you're feeling particularly techy. There are also Asustor native cloud services. So we can do this and install their data sync center, where we can link this to a Dropbox or a Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, and it's also possible to link it to an AWS server. So if you already have some heavy amounts of data available at another location, you can link this up and back up either a folder, a volume, or a portion of this to a cloud backup. Easy peasy, and you can customize the settings to do that whenever or however you want.
If you want to pick up one of these, I have links down in the description below. If you have any questions about this, let me know, and I'll get back to those questions in the follow-up video concerning home super high-speed networking.
But give me a few days to clean up my network closet first. It's not pretty, but it's fast and cost-effective.
I would pay a lot more for this just to have a 10 gig port on it. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty of how to get the network set up to do the best, I'm going to have another video on that coming soon, where I'll get into a lot more technical and physical hardware installation instructions on how to make the most of your home network without breaking the bank.
As always, thanks for stopping by. Go take some photos, and then keep them safe.